Hello, we are live. I Need Living Conversations 175th session. I'm with Sacred Blue Heron Woman. I am Julian Catari, and we're having the 10th version, the 10th session of the Dark Abyss of the System, where we go and analyze, scrutinize, and investigate about all the different situations that have happened in the world and how those situations have shaped the world into a kind of a slavery system, a system of planned misery. I love that word because that's the actual definition, like the technical definition of governments. It's planned misery. It's not a romanticized. It's not a romanticist adjective I'm using. It's the actual thing. If you take the time and look at it and analyze it and investigate it. And we have done that for you. And for 10 sessions now, we've been coming up with all this information. So get ready for this 10th session where we'll continue giving all this information about the interworkings of the system we're living in, the abyss of the system, and a system that is in the absence of the sacred, because that's the other really important definition that we have. We believe, I mean, God is out there, but it's not in here. The system has really taken us away from the sacred, and that's something that we say each time, and that it's backed by all the information that we're giving. So we're not saying anything from just passion. We are actually presenting the facts of how this happened. So welcome, everyone.
Well, the interesting thing is, all the spiritual gurus say, oh, well, money is energy. Money is just energy. So, there's plenty of money. It's just energy. And I've said already, it's not energy. It is a commodity. Created. That is what a commodity is, created by man. And money is a commodity. It was energy when the thought came into the Rothschilds' head to do this, to start the banking empire. But then it stopped being energy.
Wouldn't it be that we exchange our energy, we give for this money that is not even ours?
Yeah, exactly. So I was listening to a YouTube video about how Connie Mendez's prayers. Now, Connie Mendez was a Venezuelan singer, right, in the 70s, something like that. It's very spiritual. And so I was listening to this prayer, and she's like, I know that money is a representation of God on earth. And I was like, oh, son of a bitch. There's the answer right there. When the Pope, wow, that is blatant in your face. Money is not a representation of God. And this is the problem, right? When the Pope declared himself the vicar of Christ in the absence of, what message did Jesus teach? Love, 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 love. Love. In the absence of love, money was created to take the place of love.
Wow. Strong words, huh?
Yeah. So,
but true.
So there can be no result but misery planning with the money system we have.
Yeah, that's the point of it.
Yeah, exactly. So today we're going to talk about erasing Iraq.
Okay.
The invasion of Iraq was sold to the public on the basis of fear of weapons of mass destruction, as that was the issue agreed upon in the White House. The more rarefied reason that was not told to anybody was to create a model state. Since the entire Arab world could not be conquered all at once, a single country needed to serve as the catalyst. The U.S. would invade that country and turn it into a different model in the Arab Muslim world. Within the internal logic of this theory, fighting terrorism, spreading frontier capitalism, and holding elections were bundled into a single unified project. The Middle East would be cleaned out of terrorists, and a giant free trade zone would be created and locked in with after-the-fact elections. George Bush said it was spreading freedom in a troubled region. I remember those words clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the freedom is only for Western multinational corporations to feed off freshly privatized states. So when the idea of invading an Arab country and turning it into a model state first gained currency after September 11, the names of several countries were floated. Iraq was the one that had a great deal to recommend it because in addition to its vast oil reserves, it also made a good central location for military bases, and Saddam's use of chemical weapons on his own people made him easy to hate. But let's not forget that Saddam was put in power by the CIA.
Mm.
During the 1991 Gulf War, roughly 300 Tomahawk missiles were fired over the course of 5 weeks. In 2003, the invasion, more than 380 Tomahawk missiles were launched in a single day.
Wow.
Between March 20 and May 2, the weeks of major combat, the U.S. military dropped more than 30,000 bombs on Iraq, as well as 20,000 precision-guided missiles, 67% of the total number ever made.
Wow. That's insane.
It is. It's absolute insanity. I did not know this. Right? This shock and awe campaign was developed during the 1991 Gulf War. Shock and awe is a military doctrine that prides itself on not merely targeting the enemy's military forces, but society as large, because mass fear is a key part of the strategy.
Wow.
For Rumsfeld and Cheney, the primary impetus for invading Iraq was the desire to create a demonstration model to guide the behavior of anyone with the temerity to acquire destructive weapons or in any way flout the authority of the U.S. It was a global experiment in behaviorism. And we're seeing the same. We're seeing an experiment in behaviorism.
Like experiments, again. It's all that matters. That's what runs the world.
Yeah. As the day of, well, I mean, everything we do is, everything we're going to do in the program is experimenting, but
experimenting for good or experimenting for evil?
Experimenting for happiness planning. Happiness and love planning, right? So the experiment part isn't bad. I mean, the experiment isn't the problem. It's the motive that drives the experiment.
That's it, yeah.
As the day of the invasion of Iraq drew closer, the U.S. media outlets were conscripted by the Pentagon to fear up Iraq. 1 week before the invasion, the Pentagon invited Washington's military press corps on a special field trip to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida to witness the testing of the MOAB, Missile Ordnance something, otherwise known as the MOAB, the mother of all bombs, which is made right here in McAllister. At 21,000 pounds, it is the largest non-nuclear explosive ever built, able to create a 10,000-foot high mushroom cloud that looks and feels like a nuclear weapon. It's just one step short of a nuclear weapon.
Wow.
And this was dropped during Trump's first term of presidency. He dropped it. He had it dropped on Syria.
Okay. On Syria, wow.
Yeah. And I'll say again, this weapon is made here in Oklahoma, about an hour's drive from where I live.
That's pretty crazy.
It is.
Like in the middle, in what town?
It's south of McAllister.
Okay, it's just like in the middle of nowhere. It's not even in like a large city or anything like that.
No. Well, we have. So what's the industry of McAllister? Prison and bombs. Prison and bombs. Prison and bombs.
Oh wow. Because
we have a big state penitentiary, a maximum security state pen right outside of McAllister.
Okay.
Yeah. McAllister State Penitentiary used to be known for the rodeo. They'd have a rodeo at the prison. The prisoners would be the contestants. Mm-hmm. But they did away with that. I don't know. So, yeah, McAllister used to be known for the prison rodeo. But anyway, so prison and bombs around McAllister. So when the war began in Iraq, the residents of Baghdad were subjected to sensory deprivation on a mass scale. The ears were the first to go. On the night of March 28, 2003, as U.S. troops drew closer to Baghdad, the Ministry of Communication was bombed and set ablaze, as were 4 Baghdad telephone exchanges, cutting off millions of phones across the city. The targeting of the phone exchanges continued until by April 2, there was barely a phone working in all of Baghdad. Television and radio transmitters were also hit, making it impossible for the people of Baghdad to pick up news of what was going on outside. Many Iraqis say that the shredding of their telephone system was the most psychologically wrenching of the air attack. The combination of hearing and feeling bombs going off everywhere while being unable to call a few blocks away to find out if loved ones were alive or to reassure terrified relatives living abroad was pure torment. Next to go were their eyes. There was no audible explosion, no discernible change in the early evening bombardments, but in an instant, an entire city of 5 million people was plunged into an awful, endless night on April 4. Darkness was relieved only by the headlights of passing cars. Trapped in their homes, Baghdad residents could not speak to each other, hear each other, or even see outside. The city was shackled and hooded. And they did nothing. They did nothing to us. Nothing.
Yeah.
Let's get that straight. They did nothing. We heaped all kinds of freaking misery on them for absolutely no reason other than to heap misery on them.
And even that was planned because, like you said, they put Hussein up there so they would have the excuse. And that's how they do everything. There's not even somebody making war anymore.
Yeah,
it's like,
no, they create the problem so that they can come in with the solution.
Exactly, yeah. It's crazy.
So next, Baghdad was stripped. The bombing badly injured Iraq, but it was the looting, unchecked by occupying troops, that did the most. Let me say that again. It was the looting that was unchecked by the occupying troops. In fact, the occupying troops participated in the looting. That did the most to erase the heart of the country that it was. Baghdad is the mother of Arab culture, and they wanted to wipe out that culture. Iraq was the best education system in the region with the highest literacy rates in the Arab world in 1985. 89% of Iraqis were literate.
Wow.
By contrast, in New Mexico, 46% of the population is functionally literate, and only 20%. And 20% are unable to do basic math to determine the total on a sales receipt.
Okay, that's shocking too.
Yeah, their state senator, congressmen were so convinced of the superiority of American systems, they could imagine that the Iraqis wanted. They couldn't imagine that the Iraqis wanted their own culture and not the American culture. This neo-colonial blindness is a running theme in the war on terror. In Iraq, the cycle of culture erasing and culture replacing unfolded in a matter of weeks. Overnight, Iraq went from being one of the most isolated countries in the world, sealed off from the most basic trade by strict UN sanctions, to becoming the widest open market anywhere. There was a neatly encapsulated conference held by the US State Department in Baghdad in the early months of the occupation. This gathering featured 14 high-level politicians and bureaucrats from Russia and Eastern Europe. The VIP guests gave a small group of influential Iraqis lessons in capitalist transformation. One of the main speakers was a guy named Marek Belka, who was Poland's former right-wing finance minister. He pounded them with the message that they had to seize this moment of chaos to be forceful in pushing through policies that would throw many people out of work. Is that what's happening in the US right now? He said that the first lesson from Poland was that unproductive state-owned enterprises should be sold off immediately. His second lesson was that their market-distorting giveaways had to be stopped. 5 months after the fall of Baghdad, Iraq was in a humanitarian emergency. Unemployment was at 67%, and the only thing holding off mass starvation was the government-subsidized food and other essentials. These were the distorting giveaways that had to be scrapped immediately. A man named Paul Bremer was put in charge of the reconstruction of Iraq, and he started issuing legal decrees that was an even more radical form of shock therapy than pursued in the former Soviet Union. Iraq was to become a frontier just as Russia had been, but this time it would be US firms that would be in line for the easy billions, and nothing could deter these painful economic changes. The IMF and World Bank were relegated to supporting roles, and the US was front and center. This dynamic set Iraq apart from other earlier laboratories. Everywhere else it was the IMF and the World Bank. Now it's the US.
Mm-hmm.
Bremer was ensconced in Saddam's Turquoise Dome Palace, receiving trade and investment laws by email from the Department of Defense. He'd print them out, sign them, and impose them by fiat on the Iraqi people. Before the invasion, Iraq's economy had been anchored by its national oil company and by 200 state-owned companies which produced the staples of the Iraqi diet and the raw materials of its industry, everything from cement to paper and cooking oil. Bremer announced that these would be privatized immediately. Then he wrote laws that would attract foreign investors. One was that they could take 100% of the profits they made in Iraq out of the country, and they would not be required to reinvest them in the country, and they wouldn't be taxed on their profits. The White House was so focused on unveiling a shiny new Iraqi economy that it decided in the early days of the occupation to launch a brand new currency. Now I understand why all my fellow soldiers were betting on the Iraqi dinar, and I didn't have money to do it, but I didn't know. Now I know why. It was the US created. It just makes me sick. The money was delivered in fleets of planes and distributed in armored trucks at a time when 50% of the people had no drinking water.
Man.
The Iraq experiment entered a bold new terrain when it transformed the invasion, occupation, and reconstruction into an exciting, fully privatized new market. For reconstruction, the boom was kicked off with $38 billion from Congress, $15 billion from other countries, and $20 billion stolen from the Iraqis. Bush says this was the greatest financial commitment since the Marshall Plan. Under the Marshall Plan, American firms benefited by sending food and equipment to Europe after World War II with the explicit goal of helping war-torn economies recover as self-sufficient markets, creating local jobs, and developing tax bases capable of funding domestic social services. But the Bush cabinet actually launched the anti-Marshall Plan, a mirror opposite of the original Marshall Plan in every way. It was a plan guaranteed from the start to undermine Iraq's badly weakened industrial sector and to send Iraqi unemployment soaring. This scheme did everything possible to entice corporate America. It was this theft of Iraq's reconstruction funds from the Iraqis, justified by unquestioned racist assumptions about U.S. superiority and Iraqi inferiority, and not merely the generic demons of corruption and inefficiency that doomed the project from the start. None of the money went to the Iraqi factories so they could reopen. Iraq had virtually no role in this plan at all. Instead, the U.S. federal government contracts, most of them issued by USAID, commissioned a kind of country in the box. Designed in Virginia and Texas to be assembled in Iraq. The Iraqis were cast in the role of odd spectators. I remember that. Distinctly remember that. And I had no clue this was going on, that they weren't even allowed to participate in their own reconstruction. First, awed by U.S. military technology and then by its engineering and management prowess. In Iraq, there was not a single government function that was considered so core that it could not be handed to a contractor, preferably one who provided the Republican Party with financial contributions or Christian foot soldiers during election campaigns. So while Bremer may have signed the laws, it was the private accountants who designed and managed the economy. Think tanks were paid to think for the Iraqis, and private security firms and defense contracts were had for training Iraqis' new army and police. and education companies drafted the post-Saddam curriculum and printed out new textbooks. Can you imagine?
Yeah, it's a whole plan. It's a whole
Imposing everything. We know we don't like the fact that you're 89% literate and smarter than we are. We're going to dumb you down with our bullshit.
that's you got to hear it to believe it.
Oh, man. Meanwhile, the model pioneered by Cheney for Halliburton in the Balkans, where bases were transformed into mini Halliburton towns, was adopted on a larger scale. The Green Zone in Iraq was a Halliburton-run city-state. A Colorado-based engineering and construction company called CPA was paid $28.5 million in a joint venture with another company named 4 major contractors. Even the job of building a local democracy was privatized, given to a North Carolina company called RTI with a contract worth $466 million, though it's not clear what qualified RTI to bring democracy to a Muslim country. The leadership of the company's Iraq operation was dominated by high-level Mormons who thought that the Muslims could be persuaded to embrace the Book of Mormon as compatible with the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, and then the Iraqis would erect statues in their honor. Fucked up. Totally fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
Totally disconnected from love, without a doubt. As these foreign corporations descended on the country, the machinery in Iraq's 200 state firms stood still, frozen by chronic power blackouts. Iraq had once had one of the most sophisticated and industrial economies in the region. Now its largest firms couldn't even get a subcontract in their own country's reconstruction. American companies even imported their own cement, like their workforce from abroad, and like they did their workforce from abroad, and rather than use the local. Iraqis did not see the corporate restructuring as a gift. Most saw it as a modernized form of pillage with what it was. And the U.S. corporations didn't wow anyone with their speed and efficiency. Instead, they managed to turn the word reconstruction into a joke that nobody laughs at, as one Iraqi engineer put it. Every miscalculation by the foreign companies provoked escalating levels of resistance with counter-repression by foreign troops, ultimately sending the country spiraling into an inferno of violence. As of July 2006, the war in Iraq had taken the lives of 655,000 Iraqis who would not have died had there been no invasion or occupation.
Wow.
People have tried to say that the Iraqis preferred to indulge in old hatreds and violence rather than accept our rule of the law democracy. But the sectarian divisions and religious extremism that engulfed Iraq cannot be so neatly detached from the invasion and occupation. Although these forces might have been present in the advance of the war, they were far weaker before Iraq was turned into a U.S. shock lab. In fact, all the forces that tore Iraq apart, rampant corruption, ferocious sectarianism, the surge in religious fundamentalism, and the tyranny of death squads escalated in lockstep with the implementation of Bush's anti-Marshall Plan. After the toppling of Saddam, Iraq badly needed to be repaired and reunited, a process that could only have been led by Iraqis. Instead, the country was transformed into a cutthroat capitalist laboratory, a system that pitted individuals and communities against each other and eliminated hundreds of thousands of jobs and livelihoods, that replaced the quest for justice with rampant impunity for foreign occupiers. The fiasco of Iraq is one created by a careful and faithful application of unrestrained Chicago school ideology. The blowback started with Bremer's first major act, the firing of approximately 500,000 state workers. Does that sound familiar? What Bush Trump is doing in the White House?
And it's happening in Argentina and Chile. It's kind of a world trend. Yeah, the cutting back, they all kind of followed that model. It's all just a world agenda that,
Yeah.
that there's the illusion of countries. That's so
Yeah.
they could
No, it's
pull this off. They need to keep the illusion of individual nations.
right.
It's all just it's everybody subdued to the same bastards.
Well,
With some difference, of course, like how much terrain they've gained in some places and
yeah.
etc. And of course, where they don't have as much terrain, like Iraq, they're gonna do these kind of things so that they can gain more terrain.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So the first thing he did was fire 500,000 state workers. Most of them were soldiers, but they were also doctors, nurses, teachers, and engineers. It was called de-Baathification, the Ba'ath Party, right?
Okay.
Supposedly cleaning out Saddam loyalists. Saddam was a Ba'athist. Bremer made no secret of his antipathy for Iraq's Stalinist economy, and he had no appreciation for the specialized skills and the years of accumulated knowledge possessed by Iraq's engineers, doctors, electricians, and road builders. And let me tell you, that's a harsh freaking climate. Harsh freaking climate to build in. He should have listened. He should have, there's no U.S. person that would know how to build in that climate. Not at all. He did not consider how the sudden amputation of Iraq's professional class would make it impossible for the Iraqi state to function and therefore hinder his work. That blindness had everything to do with free market fervor. The blindness had three concrete effects. Number one, it damaged the possibility of reconstruction by removing skilled people from their posts. Number two, it weakened the voice of secular Iraqis. And three, it fed the resistance with angry people. Bremer's plan to privatize Iraq's companies and that 2/3 of them would have to lose their jobs was regarded by the Iraqis as a U.S. act of war. A worker was asked what would happen if the company he worked for would be sold. He smiled and said, "Either we will set the factory on fire and let the flames devour it to the ground, or we will blow ourselves up inside it, but it will not be privatized." Mm-hmm. So the Bush team had definitely overestimated its ability to shock the Iraqis into submission. So 400,000 of those people Bremer laid off were soldiers, and they went straight to the resistance. Now you have 400,000 armed people who are angry because they took all their weapons home with them, and they know how to use the weapons, and they have no future, and so they don't give a shit what they do. Right? So the violence is their only competitive edge. The more problems there are in Iraq, the harder it is for outsiders to get involved. Now I understand why there was so much resistance, so much blowback. They were doing their best with violence to keep us from imposing ourselves on them. Mm-hmm. More blowback came from the White House's determination to prevent future Iraqi government from changing Bremer's economic laws. Because most of Bremer's decrees were in the legal gray zone, the Bush administration's solution was to draft a new constitution for Iraq. Here we go. Let's just, make Iraq become a U.S. state. Thanks to their rejection of all things statist, the occupation authority running out of the green zone was far too understaffed and under-resourced to pull off its ambitious plans, especially in the face of the hardcore resistance. So CPA, the corporation that was set to privatize Iraq, was actually too privatized itself to privatize anything. and that's what these totally unbalanced, disconnected from love people they're not seeing, is that their stupidity is just right. Mm-hmm. The occupation of Iraq was from the start a radical experiment in hollow governance. Basically, the acceptable role of government in a corporatist state is to act as a conveyor belt for getting public money into private hands. The primes are the big corporations engaged in elaborate subcontracting schemes. In Iraq, they subcontracted to Kuwaiti companies who subcontracted to Saudis. So let's look at a simple air conditioning contract in this privatized world. right?
Hmm.
The big guy gets the contract to install all the air conditioners, right? The contractor, that contract then goes to a subcontractor, which then goes to another subcontractor, and finally a fourth level subcontractor. And the payment for air conditioning turns out to be payments to 4 contractors, the fourth of which puts a fan in the room, and that's air conditioning.
Yeah, that's how everything works
Yep.
in all governments. It's
Well,
crazy.
this is specifically under the Chicago School economics, and that's what we have to understand with the juntas that started in Argentina and Chile in the 70s. Chicago School economics has become the rule of the day. It's like we said, that just because they got rid of the dictators didn't mean they got rid of the program.
Mm. Right. We need to think about that. Hmm.
So the company named Parsons was handed 186 million to build 142 health clinics in Iraq. And out of those 142, guess how many they completed?
None.
6.
Okay.
So they walked home with 186 million,
Wow.
basically.
That was the point.
Yep. The U.S. inspector in Iraq looked into 8 projects completed by U.S. contractors that included a maternity hospital and a water purification system, and found that 7 of those 8 projects were not operating as designed.
Mhm.
In 2006, when all the main reconstruction contracts were ending, the Inspector General's office was investigating 87 cases of fraud. Corruption during the occupation was not the result of poor management decision. It was it was policy decision that caused the corruption. The company CPA, that was too privatized to privatize Iraq, was found guilty of fraud in 2006 and forced to pay $10 million. The company then asked the judge to overturn the verdict, as it claimed that CPA was not part of the U.S. government and so not subject to its laws, including the False Claims Act.
Mhm.
The Bush administration had indemnified U.S. corporations working in Iraq from any liability under Iraqi laws. This time, the judge ruled in the company's favor. He said that there was plenty of evidence that lots of false and fraudulently inflated invoices had been submitted, but had failed to prove the claims were presented to the U.S. In other words, the U.S. government presence in Iraq had been a mirage, just a funnel to get U.S. taxpayer and Iraqi oil dollars to foreign corporations where there was no there.
Mhm. They always have a good. They always get many ducks with one shot.
So Iraq represented a hollow state where there was no there.
Mhm.
After handing out its billions to contractors, the CPA melted away. The catastrophic failure to reconstruct Iraq shared direct responsibility for the most lethal form of blowback, the dangerous rise of religious fundamentalism and sectarian conflict. When the occupation proved unable to provide the most basic services, the mosques and local militia filled the vacuum. A young Shia cleric ran his own shadow reconstruction and earned himself a renowned, devoted following. He was able to have power and phone lines fixed, set up emergency generators, and more. He also took the young men who saw no jobs and dressed them in black, arming them with rusty Russian weapons. And now we had the Mahdi army, one of the most brutal forces. These militias are corporatism's legacy also.
Mhm.
Iraq under Bremer was the logical conclusion of Chicago School theory. A public sector reduced to a minimal number of employees, mainly contract workers living in a Halliburton city state, tasked with signing corporate-friendly laws and handing out duffel bags of cash to Washington contractors protected by mercenary soldiers, shielded by full legal immunity. All around them were furious people, increasingly turning to religious fundamentalism because it's the only source of power in a hollowed out state. This is where the program I've I've cut it down to initials. It's our RSR, which is resilient,
Regulating.
self-regulating, inclusive, BBK kinship, beyond blood kinship, branching
Okay.
enterprises program, is the holistic part of it is to teach us about our own power so that we don't believe that God is off planet and that money serves as his representative.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So let in a dog here. Because the bottom line is we have power.
We need to get that power back. As the Toltecs understood, that personal power is the idea that it all depends on you, and it's not, you're not bound by the destiny and hazard, and it's, as you recover your personal power, you are able to decide what happens to you.
Yeah. Well, and that's the aloha part, remembering that the breath of God, the breath of life, the breath of love, that life force is within me. It's not off planet, it's in me.
Mm-hmm.
And in you, and in right. And we don't need a church or a government to stand between us. And
right.
So Bremer wrote a policy paper in which he wrote that free trade has led to the creation of unprecedented wealth, but it has immediate negative consequences for many. It requires laying off workers. Everything leads to growing income gaps and social tension, and that leads to attacks on U.S. firms.
Mm-hmm.
The guiding assumption was that the Iraqis would be so stunned by U.S. firepower and so relieved to be rid of Saddam that they could be easily controlled. When you live in the desert in a harsh climate, I don't think you're very easily controlled.
Yeah. They didn't know who they're messing with, huh?
Yeah. And then after a few months, they would emerge from their post-war days and be pleasantly surprised to be living in an Arab Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, the Iraqis demanded a say in the transformation of their country. God forbid they should have a say in the transformation, right? And it was the Bush administration's response to this that generated the most blowback of all.
Which
all
was?
summer after Iraq's invasion, there was so much pent-up hunger for political participation that Baghdad, despite its hardships, was almost like a carnival. There was anger at Bremer's layoffs and frustration with the blackouts and contractors, but the anger was expressed mostly through exuberant free speech. There were spontaneous elections breaking out. In cities like Samarra and Mosul, religious leaders, professional and tribespeople worked together to set local priorities for reconstruction. The democratic enthusiasm combined with the clear rejection of Bremer's economic programs put the Bush administration in a difficult position. It had made bold promises to hand over power to an elected Iraqi government in a matter of months, but relinquishing power would mean abandoning the dream of turning Iraq into a model privatized economy dotted with U.S. military bases. That was the goal. There was never an intention to leave Iraq. Never.
Mm-hmm.
Economic nationalism was very deeply ingrained in the populace, especially when it came to their oil reserves. So Washington abandoned its democratic promises and instead increased the shock therapy. When Bremer first arrived in Iraq, the U.S. plan was to convene a large constituent assembly where delegates would vote for members of an interim executive council. After only 14 days in Iraq, Bremer scrapped this idea and he handpicked the members of the Iraqi governing council. No, the U.S. doesn't like to fucking anything, do they? He said the council would have governing powers, and then he changed his mind. He thought that their traditional way was too slow and deliberate, traits unsuitable for his shock therapy. Just like they had the colonizers had issues with the Indians' ways of slow, careful deliberation.
Mm.
He had another problem with the elections breaking out in towns and cities across the country. At the end of his second month in Iraq, he commanded all elections to be stopped. A big showdown happened in the city of Najaf, and the U.S. military appointed a Saddam-era colonel as Najaf's mayor, as they did in cities and towns across the country. So we got rid of Saddam. We just put his leadership back into power.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, his ban on elections came after the fact, so he just nixed what the local people had done. Can you imagine? Can you imagine how angry they would be? Put simply, if the Iraqis were allowed to freely elect their government, and if that government had power, Washington would have to give up on two of the war's main goals: the access to Iraq for military bases and full access to Iraq for multinational corporations. That was the bottom line of the war. There was nothing about freedom, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And they sold us lies, lies, lies. Just like they're doing now. Everything they're selling about Ukraine is a lie.
Mm-hmm.
Lie, lie, lie.
Hmm.
Had the Bush administration kept its promise to hand over power quickly to an elected Iraqi government, there is every chance that the resistance would have remained small rather than becoming a countrywide rebellion. But keeping that promise would have meant sacrificing the economic agenda behind the war, and that is why the violent repercussions of America's denial of democracy in Iraq must be counted as blowback.
Mm-hmm.
In the first 3.5 years of occupation, an estimated 61,500 Iraqis were captured and imprisoned by U.S. forces, usually with methods to maximize capture shock. In the early days, so now we have 61,500 fucked up Iraqis who are angrier than shit at us.
Okay.
Right? Because we freaking tortured them and broke them. And in the early days of the occupation, the Green Zone had placed a host of economic shock therapists from Poland and Russia, and now it became a magnet for the darker arts of suppressing resistance movements. The private security companies padded their ranks with veterans of the dirty wars in Colombia, South Africa, and Nepal. Blackwater and other private security firms hired more than 700 Chilean troops, most of them special forces operators who had served under Pinochet.
Mm-hmm.
I did not know that. That was news to me. One of the highest-ranking shock specialists was the U.S. Commander James Steele, who had been a key figure in Central America's right-wing crusades, where he had served as chief U.S. advisor to several Salvadorian army battalions accused of being death squads. The abuse of prisoners in Iraq did not fit the usual pattern. Usually abuses take place early in the fog of war, but Iraq was different. Things started off professional and then got worse. The shock of torture emerged immediately following Bremer's most controversial economic shocks. Late August was the end of his long summer of lawmaking and election canceling. As these moves sent more people into the resistance, U.S. soldiers were sent to shake the defiance out of Iraq. The Abu Ghraib scandal started in 2003 with an email from a captain that said, "The gloves are coming off regarding the detainees. A colonel has made it clear that we want these individuals broken." The Bush team had failed to shock Iraqis into obedience, and now the shock tactics were coming from the Kubark manual. Most of the important prisoners were taken to a place near the Baghdad airports, accessible only to special ID and hidden from the Red Cross. The facility was clandestine.
Mm-hmm.
Prisoners were held in a building designed to create the textbook Kubark conditions. The existence of this secret facility became public only when a whistleblower came forward. The detainees were not protected by the Geneva Conventions. Similar methods were used at a special operations base near Tikrit, where the prisoners were put in 4 foot by 4 foot by 20 inch high boxes. I didn't understand this. till I read something else. So the boxes, they were stuffed into these small boxes. They couldn't stand up. They couldn't lay down. They were basically squatting.
Okay. That's weird.
Strongly reminiscent of the cells described in Latin America's southern cone.
Mm-hmm.
And about 70 to, and I did, I flirted like crazy with these special operations boys and into crit. One of them brought me a big backpack full of beer, real beer, because we were only allowed near beer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Non-alcoholic beer. And it just turned my stomach when I read that. I had no clue when I was over there what these guys were doing on their base. I had no clue. I would never have welcomed them into my hospital so friendly if I had known, right? Oh, so 70 to 90% of the detentions in Iraq were a mistake. So of those 61,500 people that we fucked up, 90% of them were a mistake. 90% of them had nothing. So we fucked up.
A purpose mistake.
Yeah. Abu Ghraib was a breeding ground for insurgents. Abu Ghraib was where the prison was. I don't know if you remember the scandal that broke out.
I don't. No,
About
never
that,
heard of
there
it.
was a picture of U.S. military troops that I forget what it was. It was a disgusting picture. They were, but they showed off what they were doing.
Okay.
So Abu Ghraib was a breeding ground for insurgents. All the insults and torture made them ready to do anything. The U.S. soldiers knew that if they had a good guy and tortured him, he was now a bad guy because of how he'd been treated.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a prison near Fallujah. And the battalion that ran it were known as the Murderous Maniacs.
Okay.
Now, I guess I know I have a better understanding of why they've come home with PTSD, because you'd have to
Being
I
so
can't
evil.
imagine that most people would be willing to impose that much torture and not
feel bad about it later.
not feel bad about it. However, the situation was far worse in jails run by the Iraqis. Saddam had always relied on torture to hold power, and the U.S. just helped that along in the training of the Iraqi police. The Human Rights Watch found the picana in use in Iraq, a symbol of Latin American torture, the cattle prod.
Okay.
In El Salvador, death squads used murder not just to get rid of opponents, but to send messages of terror. Mutilated bodies appeared on the roadsides and had a sign bearing the signature of the death squad. And by 2005, these sorts of messages were a regular sight on roadsides in Iraq. A psychiatrist that was a colleague of Ewan Cameron, who was part of the Kubark Manual, right, created it, said the Freudians had developed all these subtle methods of peeling the onion to get at the heart of the problem. Cameron wanted it to drill right through into hell with the layers, but as we have discovered, the layers is all there is. Cameron dreamed of creating brand new personalities, but his patients weren't reborn. They were just injured and physically broken. So Iraq shock therapists blasted away at the layers too, seeking that elusive blank slate on which to create their new model country. And they found only a pile of rubble that they themselves had created, and millions of psychologically and physically shattered people, shattered by war, shattered by one another. Bush's in-house disaster capitalists didn't wipe Iraq clean. They just stirred up the hornet's nest. Countries, like people, don't reboot to zero with a good shock. They just break and keep on breaking.
Mm-hmm.
In the 70s, when the Corpus Crusade began, it used tactics that the courts ruled were overtly genocidal, the deliberate erasure of a segment of the population. In Iraq, something more monstrous happened, the erasure of an entire country. It began with the disappearance of women behind veils and doors, and then the children disappeared from the schools. Then the professionals, doctors, professors, entrepreneurs, scientists, pharmacists, judges, and lawyers. An estimated 300,000 Iraqis were assassinated by death squads after the U.S. invasion.
Wow.
And thousands more fled the country. In 2007, 3,000 a day were leaving, and 4 million had been forced to leave their homes. So roughly 1 in 7 people were now homeless. And only a few hundred of those refugees had been welcomed into the U.S. With Iraqi industry all but collapsed, one of the only local bombing businesses was kidnapping. In 2006, nearly 20,000 people were kidnapped in Iraq. Torture also emerged as a thriving industry. It is only when the people who live on the land refuse to abandon their past that the dream of the clean slate morphs into its doppelganger, the scorched earth. and then the dream of creation morphs into a campaign of total destruction. So let's stop here with that scorched earth. We are currently carpet bombing the Gaza Strip, scorched earth, to make way for a Gaza Singapore.
Same story, maybe. So
same story. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Iraq was the boldest campaign of crisis exploitation. A bipartisan study group in the U.S. called for the U.S. to assist Iraqi leaders to reorganize the national oil industry as a commercial enterprise and to encourage investment in Iraqi's oil sector by the international community and international energy companies. Most of the study's group's recommendations were ignored by the White House, but not the oil one. The Bush administration immediately pushed ahead by helping draft a radical new law for Iraq, which allowed companies like Shell to sign 30-year contracts in which they would keep a large share of Iraq's oil profits, with its resulting sentence of perpetual poverty in a country where 95% of government revenues come from oil. At the point when this law was pushed forward, Iraq was facing its most profound crisis. The country was being torn apart by sectarian violence, with an average of 1,000 Iraqis killed every week. The law was forced into Iraq's cabinet in February 2007, then placed no limits on the amount of profits that foreign companies could take from the country, and made no specific requirements about how much or how little foreign investors would partner with Iraqi companies or hire Iraqis to work in the oil fields. Most brazenly, it excluded Iraq's elected parliamentarians from having any say in the terms for future oil contracts. Instead, it created a new body, the Federal Oil and Gas Council, that would be advised by experts from outside Iraq. This was disaster capitalism at its most shameless. There was another little discussed consequence of the chaos in Iraq. The longer it wore on, the more privatized the foreign presence became, ultimately forging a new paradigm for the way wars are fought and how human catastrophes are responded to. At the start of the Iraqi occupation, there were 10,000 private soldiers in Iraq, and 3 years later, there were 48,000. This is called corporate mission creep. During the first Gulf War in 1991, there was one contractor for every 100 soldiers. At the start of the 2003 Iraqi invasion, the ratio was one contractor for every 10 soldiers. 3 years into the occupation, it was one contractor for every 3 soldiers. And in the 4th year of occupation, there was one contractor for every 1.4 soldiers. Made possible by September 11, 2001, the war in Iraq represented nothing less than the violent birth of a new economy. A year and a half into the Iraq occupation, this is the most important part of this. The U.S. State Department launched a new branch, the Office of Reconstruction and Stabilization, On any given day, this office is paying private contractors to draw up detailed plans to reconstruct 25 different countries on any given day for one reason or another that find themselves a target of U.S. sponsored destruction from Venezuela to Iran. On any given day, they are planning misery
Man.
for 25 countries.
Mm-hmm.
Corporations and consultants are lined up on pre-signed contracts so that they are ready to leap into action as soon as disaster strikes.
Wow.
You have it right there. It's all laid out, the planned misery. And that is what we are walking away from. I will no longer tolerate this bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
It's time to bring this system to an end.
And we have to understand how powerful we are in doing that and how much we weigh, as in if we get away from that, if we take our energy, stop giving it to that system and bring it back to Mother Earth, that's already a lot to do, because everybody would think, well, what difference would it make if I choose to join? That's not going to end that. But that mindset is not helpful at all, because it's keeping everyone there.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the first step. Maybe after that we'll find other things we can do to stop this. But first step is stop supporting that. Stop. How do you? The way you say it, where you say walk away from that, but you also say stop. Stop being part of it.
Yeah.
Tolerating, that's what you say. Stop tolerating.
We will no longer tolerate. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So the first step to not tolerate that is to find a complete holistic way to get out of that system. And that's not a simple thing. And that's why we need these atavistic, self-regulating, wrenching enterprises. That's what the project is. And you're welcome to learn more about it and join us once you do that. Otherwise, what's next week's conversation about?
Well, next week we're going to talk about Sri Lanka and some other countries, and then end with Israel, and that will help us understand better what's going on the Gaza Strip right now. And then after that, I was going to go into how people are building, how they've woken up from the shock, but if it sounds like they're not, it sounds like Argentina and Chile are going back through the same bullshit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you think we can change it for Tuesday for next week? Because I would be traveling on Wednesday.
Right, you're going to Teotihuacan.
Yep.
Oh, I'm jealous.
So let's change it for Tuesday. Yeah. Tuesday at 8 or 8:15.
8:15 is good.
8:15 Central Standard Time for the U.S. It's 7:15 here in Mexico time, and we will continue then talking about the 11th session of the abyss of the system, the dark abyss of the system, in the absence of the sacred. Well, thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week.